Recording in progress.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Cannabis and Sports Conference. Thanks for sticking with us on day 3. My name is Amanda Barton. I'm a partner with Mr. Cannabis Law. Mr. Cannabis Law is a boutique firm here in the state of Florida with locations in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut that focuses on helping companies in the cannabis and psychedelic industry. Specifically, we focus on business transactions such as helping with application processes, drafting contracts, negotiating deals on behalf of companies, mergers and acquisitions and whatnot. I'm very excited about our panel here today. As an inner nerd and somebody who absolutely loves the science and learning about how these policies and rules are actually implemented in the sports industry, we're going to have a great panel here for you today. First, we're going to have Michael Minardi, who's a lawyer with Minardi Law. He's also very involved with Regulate Florida, which is doing wonderful things in the state of Florida with regards to pushing forward new regulatory laws and trying to legalize cannabis within the state of Florida. We also have Dr. Mindy Shelby, who is a senior scientist with Aegis Science Corporation. So we are going to hear from her today. And we also have Steve Walz, who is the Associate Athletic Director and Director of Athletic Medicine at University of South Florida. So you have a rock star panel that here today, and we'll just get right into it. So Mr. Minardi, he will be talking about cannabis and collective bargaining sports agreements, what athletes need to know. At the end of all 3 sessions, we will have a Q&A, so please jot down your questions, and we'll open it up to all questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to you guys for having this event. Beautiful hotel and spacious, awesome so far. Greatly appreciate it. My name is Michael Minardi. As she said, I have been practicing attorney for the past 20 years, always focused and with a goal on the cannabis space. I was one of the first attorneys in the state really talking about this issue and pushing it and promoting it. Worked with and pushing and passing medical marijuana, and we've been practicing and working for the past probably about 6 years now about working to get legalization in this state for all adults. In addition to that, I also am now running for office for the Florida House of Representatives in order to try to continue to open up this dialogue and expand those issues in the legislature. As many people know, if you are here in Florida, we have a very limited market. We have a very restricted practice and products for our patients, and really don't have the availability that they need on a day-to-day basis with product availability, modes of ingestion, and options. Pricing is also very difficult. So we're continuing working on that. As part of the law firm, and where I kind of got into this issue with collective bargaining agreements is we also represent people in this cannabis space in all aspects, from criminal defense. Also, we do some corporate stuff. But we have been working in the past few years with these types of collective bargaining agreements. I don't know how to, I'm supposed to click it. All right. Should have got a lesson first. Is it the green one?
Yeah.
So I got into this realistically because we had clients who were fired, kicked out of school for using cannabis, disciplined. And we believe that as a medicine, especially, that shouldn't be happening, right? That's the whole goal. This is supposed to be used as a medicine to supplement opiates, to supplement other type of narcotics that people didn't want to use from the harmful side effects. So in that, they should be treated the same, correct? Right? When you have an opiate prescription or something of that nature, typically you're able to go in and provide a copy of your prescription and as proof that you had a justified use of that substance in your body. So that's how we got, because we have 3 of those cases going throughout the state of Florida. We believe that they will establish precedent for all patients here in the state. And so that's how we got into this industry and looking at these, and this is on all levels. It does impact sports. I don't know where everyone is, so overview of basically what a collective bargaining agreement is. It's a contract. It's usually between a union and an employer, or in sports case, it's a players association or organization. I mean, NFL was a 501c3 for years. In order to create basically the framework of how those agencies would work together. I recommend this in all agreements, all partnerships, and people work with. One of the biggest problems that we have with corporate startups and things of that nature, friends, family, they don't have agreements. So this goes down to micro level up to this macro level. And then you don't know what happens when there's problems, when there's issues that come up. So it's on behalf of the players and employers. It's usually a union that is part of this. It's not individual players or individual contracts. This is usually a unionized agreement. So we do see it not only in sports, but we see it in the cases that we were dealing with right now. We're dealing with Department of Corrections for a Department of Corrections worker getting fired for using cannabis. We're dealing with it with Hillsborough County and the firefighters union, who have policies regarding this. So it is great because it encompasses all aspects between the parties. So it's wages, salaries, terms, and these can all be negotiated. And I think that's the most and biggest important thing that you have here. These are negotiated terms between the parties. One of the things that it can do is it can limit your access to the courts. So it can require binding arbitration. So therefore, instead of going to the courts or having a jury or having a judge determine each party's legal rights, it's basically an independent party or mediator paid by both individuals who makes a binding decision on both parties. And they can and required to agree to that. In most states, those are always upheld. There's a national sort of law that favors arbitration agreements, but they do have to be clear and unmistakable as to all the terms and conditions they provide, and they could have legal and constitutional restrictions, and there are questions as to whether or not the ADA could still apply, and that's a federal law. It's needed for these reasons. Everyone knows their rights and responsibilities to settle grievances. That's usually the biggest issues that happen. We hear about this all the time in sports. If an athlete does something wrong or something that a company or one of the teams feels is outside the purview of their contract, right, they go through a grievance procedure. Payment. We've seen this with drug testing, many times in the NFL, from the days of really Ricky Williams was the first one to start this issue, and, it continues today. We still ruined some careers, honestly, I think, of many NFL players for testing positive for cannabis. I can't think of his name right now, but I'm sure many people can. The wide receiver from the Browns. He basically was in and out of treatment for years, and really, this agreement and his issues, and really we all found out it was mental health, issues that caused this. So those terms and agreements have to be in there so everyone knows how to settle those grievances. And it has changed over time because of the laws throughout the country. Establishes wages, raises. We hear about this all the time in the different leagues. Minimum salaries for players. NBA. We talk about the senior exemptions, the league minimums, things of that nature. All of those aspects are contained. Substance abuse penalties and overall protection of the parties. It is for both parties. Cannabis. Again, this is a negotiated point of the agreement. State or federal policy in these agreements really does not matter. So, regardless of whether or not, it's legal in this state and I'm a player in this state, I should be able to use that. That's really irrelevant. An agreement between two parties can really contract for anything. Penalties, fines, there are in many leagues therapeutic use exemptions. In some of those leagues, it's limited as to what they can request a therapeutic use for. But it does allow players to use prohibited substances, requires medication must be necessary, medical records, and basically a history of the person's use of other substances potentially in spaces like this to determine what is or is not permitted. And then the last question, does the ADA apply? So the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that is typically prevents discrimination for any individual for a job or position as a result of their disability, which does include medicines. So disabilities include past, present, and perceived disabilities. The PGA Tour versus Martin was one of the cases in the front of the Supreme Court, and that was a golfer who had he had a condition which basically caused him, he couldn't walk the course. So he asked the PGA for an exemption to allow him to use a cart. And that's what that lawsuit was about, as to whether or not, because he's on a public golf course and things of that nature, because anyone could apply for the US Open and they could pay a fee or they could qualify, whether or not that required a public accommodation within the ADA. And that is the intake. They have to first determine whether or not there's a disability, and then the entity has to establish that making such modification would fundamentally alter the nature of such an accommodation. The Supreme Court affirmed the accommodations in this case because it would not alter the fundamental character of the competition by allowing this individual to use a cart. Instead, they said that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was intended to have sweeping reach and protections, even to talented athletes, that it can, and the question becomes, right, can it be applied in other sports? In that case, they did determine that it didn't change the fundamental nature of the game, because the fundamental nature of the game was hitting the ball into the hole. It wasn't necessarily whether or not you use a cart or walking. And that the accommodation wasn't unreasonable or didn't give him a significant advantage because of the fact that, he, because of his disability, is more fatigued than these regular players even walking the course anyway. So that's how they pretty much allowed it and permitted it. But the question became, does it apply to other sports? And so there are a few no cases out of the NFL or NBL, MLB, or other agencies that I've seen, but there is a few different articles on it that discusses this issue, and I do think it's very interesting. And it focuses on the perceived injuries and perceived disabilities. So example, which would be an NFL Combine, ADA prohibits potentially medical exams, blood work, x-rays, which are otherwise forbidden medical examinations. We all know potentially you go in for an employer, they can't ask you what prescription drugs you're on. They can't ask you if you have any disabilities or accommodations. As long as you can provide the functions of that job, they can't, discriminate against you. So the ADA prohibits employment tests unless they are job-related and consistent with business necessity. Job-related is fairly and accurately measures the individual's ability to perform the essential functions of the job. So in the NFL specifically, the question has become, could things like the 40-yard dash, the bench press, and things of that nature, are those job-related? Are those related to playing the game of football? Are those performance tests? Are those medical examinations that they're doing to evaluate the player's performance? An issue came up, and because of the, again, perceived disability issue. So you may not necessarily have a disability, it may not affect you now, but what if you have something that may be potentially, that gets worse over time? One example, and there was an individual with this issue, but chronic arthritis. They knew that he had chronic arthritis in his shoulders through x-rays. He went and performed at the Combine. They specifically looked at his bench press to see whether or not that arthritic condition would have an effect on his performance. And he only did 21 reps. The scouts and people believe that as a result of that perceived disability, now again, does a bench press determine whether or not he can be a top-notch, or he was a top 10 candidate, and moved out of that top 10 space, allegedly, or perceivedly from the analyst, because of this perceived disability. And does that violate the ADA as a result of that? Now, the question in many parts becomes, does it with an athlete of that caliber? Is it something that is, do you have a 6'8" person who can run a, 5-second 40, but he has an arthritic condition? Or, we see this with knee injuries and things like that with NFL players, and really all sports with injuries. That's why they insure their bodies and things of that nature, to protect against these issues. But is it a violation of the ADA on a technical basis? Will we end up seeing these lawsuits in the future? And we just really don't know. The ADA would require accommodation of a medicine, and this is, again, cannabis. So we dealt with, as well, someone who was, so WADA is Olympic National Organization of Drug Abuse, a young gentleman who was a one-armed archer, and he had, under a previous administration, was able to use a therapeutic use exemption to use cannabis. A new administration came in, he applied, and he was denied. He used it for, the phantom limb syndrome. And so we, sort of contacted them, figured out what was going on. We provided more medical records, and they ended up accepting it. But not all agencies do allow, or sports entities allow cannabis to be used as a therapeutic use exemption. And that depends, but they do allow it for other things. For example, could it be used for anxiety and chronic pain? The NFL has a specific policy for ADHD and medications that people use that would otherwise be prohibited substances. Typically, those prohibited substances are any Schedule I and Schedule II substances. In the U.S., despite the fact that there's, we have almost 1 million patients here in Florida, there's probably 20, 30, I don't know what the national amount of patients are throughout the state. Cannabis is still a Schedule I substance, which means it has no accepted medical use. It's unsafe under medical supervision, and therefore it is banned. But so therefore, typically, these substances would not be subject to a therapeutic use exemption. But again, the question is, would there be, in the same thing that we're arguing here for Florida employees, would the ADA require, and this is a little bit sticky because it is still federally illegal for cannabis under the ADA with these national organizations, but something in the state here like we're arguing, would the ADA or the Florida Disabilities Act require an accommodation by an employer? It's our position that it absolutely should if it is a reasonable and necessary medication that they have to use. They've tried other medications, and this is the one that works. So will these things probably happen potentially? I think in different areas and organizations we will see them. Luckily, most professional sports agencies have stopped testing for THC. They seem to test for cannabinoids and synthetic cannabinoids, and or have limited their policies or modified their policies so it's not an immediate suspension, fine, and things of that nature for people using it. That's all I have about collective bargaining agreements. These are extremely important. The one thing that I think, if you're either working with an agency or a players union, you represent them in any capacity, or you're an athlete yourself, what you really have to do, and the most important thing, is to talk to your union reps, talk to the people, get other athletes or get other people on board with the policy change, and go to them collectively and say, hey, listen, as players, it's not just one or two of us, we want the union to fight for these rights for us, because that's really the only way that you can get them and establish them and protect them, is through that negotiated agreement with the people, instead of having lawsuits and issues. I don't know if those will end up happening. Again, I think it would be very interesting if a professional athlete did request an accommodation on the basis of one of these things, just because of the idea of someone with that physique and the fact they're professional athletes being so talented to be able to establish a disability may be very interesting. But these players are putting their lives on the line and doing everything that they can in order to play professional sports, and they should have every opportunity that they have based on their performance on the field, and not necessarily some of these arbitrary tests. Some of the language about the combine and things of those natures are that they're not really at all necessary. They don't really provide much insight on performance on the field, and really the tape of these players on the field is really where it's at, and that's where this should be located, and these other things are potentially violation of their rights, under both federal law and most state laws as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. There really is, like you mentioned, power in numbers, and I think why some of the changes that have occurred in these leagues with their testing policies and more acceptance is because players and people have rallied together to try to effectuate change. And the only way we can keep pushing this forward is to keep working in groups. And it's amazing to hear that while we might not be able to stop the testing completely, being able to negotiate things like the therapeutic use exemption to benefit the players. Everything's, as lawyers we say, everything's negotiable. So, it really makes sense to hire an attorney and get an attorney involved that can help advocate on your behalf. So thank you very much. You shared some great insight. I'm excited for the Q&A session in a little bit. Next up is Dr. Mindy Shelby, who's going to talk about the current trends in testing for cannabis use in athletes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you today. Before I get started, I do need to mention that the following material presented is the property of Aegis Sciences Corporation, and any reproduction is not authorized without express written permission. Okay, so the objectives of today's study is that, one, we're going to be looking at positive marijuana results from Aegis Sciences Corporation university and college clients. We'll discuss the testing methodology, biological matrices used and testing considerations, thresholds used in cannabis testing, and we'll talk about some passive inhalation studies. We'll look at historical and current marijuana positivity, and we'll also examine that positivity by cutoff. And then we'll talk briefly about CBD and Delta-8 THC products and their potential influence on test results. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because I heard that you all were cannabis experts. Okay, so let's talk about cannabis testing in sports. That was initially prohibited in various sports. So as a international sporting federation could decide to prohibit in their federation, and therefore cannabis was only prohibited in certain sports. Now, in 1998, there was a Canadian snowboarder, Ross Rabaliati. He got a gold medal, but he also tested positive for marijuana. And now the International Ski Federation prohibited marijuana with a cutoff of 15 nanogram per mil. Now, at that time, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, did not explicitly ban marijuana. And so this case went before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and they ruled that there was not agreement between the Ski Federation and the IOC, and that because the IOC did not explicitly prohibit it, that the IOC did not have authority to strip that medal, and so they reinstated it. Now, the IOC closed that loophole a few months later that same year in 1998. But things changed a little bit when the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, took over management of the prohibited list, and that was in 2004. And what they did was they prohibited cannabinoids for all sports, and they prohibited in competition. So what this means is that if an athlete were tested out of competition and they happened to be positive for marijuana, they wouldn't suffer any penalty because it wasn't prohibited out of competition, only in competition. And they implemented this with a testing threshold of 15 nanogram per mil. Okay, so let's talk about some testing methodologies. So sports testing is a lot like forensic testing. So what that means is you typically have a screen or an initial assay and also a confirmation assay where needed. And the confirmation assay typically is done on a second aliquot of the specimen. So immunoassay is typically used for a screen or an initial assay, and the purpose there is to give a very quick differentiation between negative or presumptive non-negative samples. Now, immunoassay is not able to confirm the presence of a drug in a specimen. Now, I do need to mention also, I have mass spectrometry listed under confirmation, but it can also be used as a screening technology, so you can screen with mass spectrometry and also confirm with mass spectrometry. The difference between the two there is that mass spectrometry is definitive and it can determine whether or not a specific drug or metabolite is present in a specimen. So when I was talking about immunoassay, it is a very sensitive test, but it lacks specificity. So immunoassay, you can test urine for, let's say, opioids. And immunoassay can indicate that a sample is non-negative for opioids, but it cannot tell you which opioid is present. That would require mass spectrometry confirmation. Okay, the other issue with immunoassay and why it can't confirm the presence of a drug is there's a thing called cross-reactivity. So other drugs, and they don't necessarily have to be of the same class, can trigger a non-negative presumptive result. And let's take cannabinoids, for example. In the scientific literature, over-the-counter substances such as acetylsalicylic acid, that's not easy for me to say, and proton pump inhibitors, and also non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen or naproxen, those have in some instances produced a non-negative or a presumptive immunoassay result. But when the sample goes for confirmation, then the actual marijuana metabolite is not present, and so that is sometimes referred to as a false positive result. And another issue with immunoassay is that you can also get false negative results, and this would be in some situations like if you had a dilute urine sample. When individuals are drinking a bunch of urine, that drives drug concentration down below cutoffs, and therefore you could have drug in the specimen but below the cutoff. Okay, so let's talk about biological matrices that are used in various testing considerations. So at Aegis, we test for cannabis use in both oral fluid and urine. I do need to point out that oral fluid is not biological matrices that is approved in WADA or NCAA, but it is approved for other types of testing like workplace drug testing uses oral fluid, and we also use this in sports. Okay, so urine is actually the gold standard for testing. As I mentioned, WADA and NCAA are all using urine. So at the bottom of the screen is the metabolism of THC, and the compound on the far right is what we call carboxy-THC. And this is the predominant metabolite in urine, and it's been chosen in all drug testing policies to be the marker for cannabis use in urine. Now, interestingly, there have been variable thresholds and cutoffs that are applied, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, regarding the detection window for carboxy-THC in urine, that also is quite variable. Acute use of marijuana can be detected for up to 3 to 5 days. And there's a study in which 73% of chronic marijuana users were negative by 2 weeks after their last use. However, heavy chronic users have been able to test positive for at least 30 days, sometimes up to 60 days. The longest period in scientific literature is 95 days. We did test with a school that had some 300 plus pounders, and their drug testing policy was that the individual had to be drug-free. The drug couldn't be in their system at all before they could return to play. In those athletes, we were testing them every 3 to 4 days, and being heavy chronic users and over 300 pounds, they were negative by about 45 to 60 days following their alleged last use. Okay, so let's talk about oral fluid. Oral fluid is a little bit different. We're not looking for carboxy-THC, we're looking for parent THC. And this is because in oral fluid, typically parent drugs are present at a higher concentration than our metabolites, so it's the opposite of urine. And also, drug concentrations in oral fluid are much less than urine, so the threshold and cutoff is going to be lower than what you see in urine. Now, in oral fluid, positive results are likely due to a depot effect or oral cavity contamination, and because of this, the detection window is limited to recent use. Okay, so let's talk about some of the urine thresholds and how they've changed over time. One of the first thresholds implemented was a workplace threshold. This has got a screen. As I mentioned, we have forensic testing, so there's typically a screen and confirm. The screening threshold was 50 nanogram per mil, and the confirm was 15 nanogram per mil. Now, in the 90s, there came about zero tolerance thresholds, which really sought to reduce the screen and confirmation thresholds. So the screen was reduced to 20 and confirmation down to 5. As I mentioned, when WADA implemented their cannabis threshold, excuse me, they used a 15 nanogram per mil. Now, I did not list a screening threshold here. That's because in my experience, WADA labs don't always use immunoassay for cannabinoid testing. They may use mass spectrometry as a screen. And when the screening technology is going to match the confirm technology, there's no need to have like a 50 versus 15. It's all the same 15. That's why it's only listed like that. Okay, so in 2013, WADA increased their confirmation threshold from 15 nanogram per mil to 150 nanogram per mil. And the idea here, I think, was really more to have this indicated as recent use. And that's because, if you remember, cannabinoids are prohibited in competition. That long urine detection window was somewhat problematic with a cutoff of 15. Okay, so I think it was about 2016, the NFL decided that they would implement a confirmation threshold of 35. Now, the reason they did that was they said they didn't want any athletes being punished for being exposed passively to marijuana and being positive. So they implemented the 35, and a few years later, in 2019, NCAA adopted that confirmation threshold. Now, NFL has since moved to the WADA threshold of 150 nanogram per mil, and finally, just this past year, NCAA also adopted the 150 nanogram per mil threshold. Okay, so since some of the thresholds had, were concerned about passive inhalation, I thought we'd just talk briefly about some of the passive inhalation studies. Now, there were quite a few studies in the 1980s that looked at passive exposure to marijuana under extreme conditions. In these conditions, the studies are typically done in a car or a small room, and they're both in unventilated situations, and they did produce positive marijuana results. And I should point out, this was considered extreme conditions because a lot of times the subjects of the study had to wear goggles because the level of smoke in the area was so thick and irritating, they couldn't stand it. Okay, so a more realistic study was, there was a study of passive inhalation in a Netherlands coffee shop. So cannabis smoking was allowed in the coffee shop, so this was just participants going in and sitting around in the coffee shop for a period of time. Now, in that study, carboxy THC was not detected any greater than 8 nanogram per mil. And the 8 nanogram per mil maximum concentration was observed 6 hours following the exposure. Now, there was an individual in the study that was positive at 7 nanogram per mil at 14 hours following exposure. So some of the prior studies were criticized because they said, well, that was a low percentage THC cannabis, and nowadays the cannabis concentration is much, or the THC concentration in cannabis is much higher. So a recent study evaluated passive exposure of 11.3% THC marijuana. And they examined this in both ventilated and unventilated rooms. Now, in the unventilated room, again, individuals had to wear goggles because the level of smoke was so irritating. But in that unventilated study, the maximum carboxy THC concentration observed was 57 nanogram per mil, and that was observed between 4 and 6 hours following the exposure. Now, what was interesting was they also did this in under ventilated conditions. So this would, anything that typically has like an air conditioning, if you have air conditioning, you have ventilation. So in that situation, the maximum concentration of carboxy THC observed was 15 nanogram per mil, and that was only observed in the 4 to 6 hour collection following exposure. Okay, so let's also look at oral fluid. Oral fluid, they did the same study that they did on urine. This is basically 6 smokers, 6 non-smokers in both ventilated and unventilated conditions. Now, for oral fluid, maximum concentrations observed they occurred immediately. It's probably because they're breathing it in and it's in that oral cavity. But we did see, it's not our study, I'm sorry. They did see a decrease, a rapid decrease within 1 to 3 hours. In the ventilated conditions, actually, THC was less than 2 nanogram per mil, which was the threshold, after 2 hours. And in the unventilated conditions, in which, again, they had to wear goggles, the THC was less than 2 nanogram per mil after 12 hours. Okay. And there was another study of passive inhalation in oral fluid. This was in an unventilated van. The exposure was 20 minutes. There were 4 smokers, and in that study, none of the samples had THC greater than the threshold of 2 nanogram per mil. Okay, so what you're looking at here is marijuana positivity in our university and college clients, and it's quite historical. So the dates go from July 1st to June 30th. This is representing a school year, okay? So we're going all the way back to 0506 up to current. So one thing that you can see is from 0506 to roughly 2014-15, its positivity was fairly flat, with anything happening before 0809 being less than 4% positivity. Now, from 0809 to 2014-15, positivity was greater than 4. Now, we did see an exception in the 2010-2011 school year. Interestingly enough, this coincides with the introduction and popularity of synthetic cannabinoids. So, and we started testing for synthetic cannabinoids at that time. So we did see a drop in cannabis testing. Marijuana positivity. We did see a drop in that in natural marijuana smoking with the popularity of synthetic cannabinoids. But almost the next year, it's almost like we saw a little bit of a rebound back to that, as the positivity was 4.9%. So it was roughly flat until about 2014-15, and then by 15-16, we started to see a steady increase in marijuana positivity. Now, the largest positivity that you see here is for 2020-2021. I do need to say that I think that number may be artificially elevated because of the small number of testing that we performed during this time. When COVID happened, essentially everybody shut down. A lot of sports were not testing anybody for drugs of abuse. Instead, they were testing everybody for COVID. So I think, it's possible that that large 14.6 positivity may be artificially elevated. For 2021-22, this past school year, certainly the universities and colleges have started to pick back up with testing. It's not quite to the level that it was pre-COVID, but certainly the numbers were much more than the 2020 year. Okay, so I wanted to look at positivity by cutoff because of the variable cutoffs. Now, I went all the way back to 2013 to 2022, and unfortunately, I should point out that not all of the cutoffs were in play for the entire period of time. So one way that you can sort of look at this data is to compare everything that has the same screening cutoff. And so if we consider all of the samples that were screened with a 20, so we have screening 20 with a confirm 5, screen 20 with a confirm 15, screen 20 with a confirm 35, and screen 20 with a confirm 150. Now, in this situation, because they're all screened with 20, the positivity is dependent really upon the confirmation threshold. And so we might expect to see the highest positivity with the lowest cutoff. And if you don't consider the 2035, you do see that the 20s, screen 20, confirm 5, has a higher positivity, and that tends to decrease down to the screen 20, confirm 150. Now, it turns out that as far as the screen 20, confirm 35, one of the things I need to point out here is it looks much larger, so it's a little bit odd. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll get into that in the next slide. Let's look then at the ones that were screened with 50. Now, this was where it got a little weird because, as I mentioned, all of the screens are 50, so you're looking at the confirm cutoff to determine the positivity. And we would expect maybe the lower concentration to have the higher positivity, as we saw with the 20, but it was opposite in this one. And another way that you can look at the data is to keep the confirmation thresholds the same, and then compare what happens when you change the screening threshold or lower the screening threshold. So we could compare a screen 20 confirm 5 with a 50 screen confirm 5. And you can see it was as we expected, to where the lower screening number had a higher positivity. And we see that with the confirm at 5 and the confirm at 15. We did not see that at the confirm with 150 because those results were a little bit odd. I think in a way that may be due to the number of samples that were run per various cutoff. So you may be looking at the very large 31% positivity and the number 10 and 2. This data represents our dilute specimen reflex test. So individuals sometimes attempt to beat a drug test by ingesting large volumes of water, and as I mentioned previously, this drives down drug concentration in urine. So once a specimen has been identified as dilute, our clients can order this dilute specimen reflex test, and it essentially lowers both the screening and the confirm cutoff. And so I think what we're seeing here is basically individuals that have diluted their sample, maybe in an attempt to beat a drug test. The other one, the 4.2, that represents our oral fluid data, and I was a little surprised that the oral fluid positivity was larger than the urine positivity. So I decided, because of some of the weirdness with the data before, and as I mentioned, the thresholds were different in different periods, to look at the positivity by cutoff just for the past school year. And you can see, you know, in the previous slide, we had 20 to 35 had the higher positivity at 10. And here, if you consider the samples with screen 20, it actually has the lowest positivity. So I think what was going on with the data previously is that the 2035, if you remember, we only implemented that in 2019. Well, the 2019, 2020, 2021, all of the positivity for those particular years was much higher than previous years. And so I think that was what was causing the 2035 to look so high compared to the other cutoffs there. So here we have pretty comparable positivity cutoff. The 2015 was oddly higher than the other ones, which was unexpected. I was pleased to see that the oral fluid was exactly identical to our most predominant cutoff of 25. That made a lot of sense to me. And we had that huge dilute specimen reflex positivity also. Okay, so let's talk really briefly, because I'm running out of time, about unexpected marijuana results. One is that there is unregulated THC content in CBD and hemp products, and thus they can result in a positive marijuana or carboxy-THC test result. So this can be dependent upon the type of product, the amount and frequency of ingestion of use, individual pharmacokinetics for the individual taking it, and purification in the manufacturing process of the product. So I wanted to draw attention to a 2020 study, which was a 4-week administration of a 0.02% THC product. So this is like 10 times less than the allowable limit in a CBD product. And this amounted to an administration daily of less than 1 milligram per day. And in 9 of 14 participants, carboxy-THC was detected in urine in a range from 8 to 71 nanogram per mil. So that was a little bit of a shocker because of how low the percentage of THC was in that product. Okay, so let's talk about CBD products. The legal limit for THC allowed in CBD products can be 0.3% to 5%, depending on state-specific regulations. I think Georgia has a allowable up to 5% of THC in some medicinal CBD products. The manufacturing and purification process is not currently regulated by the FDA. I did want to point out a 2017 study of CBD products sold online. They found that only 31% contained the CBD amount advertised on the label. Okay, so I'm going to move into Delta 8 THC, and I know you guys are cannabis experts, so you may already know this. Delta 8 THC is also a psychoactive cannabinoid of cannabis sativa. It is nearly identical to THC. It differs only in the placement of a double bond. It also binds CBD1 and CBD2 receptors, and it produces similar effects to THC, although less potent. And it also shares a similar metabolism. So similar to how we look for carboxy-THC in urine, it also produces delta-8 carboxy-THC in urine. Okay, so in cannabis, the delta-8 THC averages about 0.65%, and the maximum observed has been 3%. There was a study where essentially they took samples that were positive for delta-9 carboxy-THC, and then they said, we're going to take these and we're going to look for delta-8 carboxy-THC, and they did detect it in a range of 0.22 to 8.9 nanogram per mil. The percentage of delta-8 carboxy-THC to delta-9 carboxy-THC averaged 0.68% and ranged from 0.05 to 2.83%. Okay, so delta-8 THC can be readily synthesized from CBD. It is available in gummies and vapes over the counter. And due to the naturally low levels in hemp, it's thought that delta-8 may be being synthesized and added to hemp and sold as legal hemp products. So there is confusion regarding the legal status of such products. Some states are choosing to define delta-8 as controlled substances, and others are prohibiting production and sale. So regarding testing, immunoassay tests is not going to be able to distinguish between delta-8 and delta-9 THC isomers. So the use of a delta-8 product will likely produce a non-negative immunoassay test result. Now, confirmatory testing, which is done by mass spectrometry, may not be able to distinguish between isomers unless the isomers are separated via the test method. At Aegis, we do have separation, and we know that we're not calling delta-8 carboxy-THC as a delta-9 carboxy-THC positive result. So the other trick here is that like CBD products, delta-8 products may contain delta-9 THC, so depending upon the use of the product, it is possible that they could result in a positive delta-9, not because of misidentification, but because of the presence of THC there. Okay, so to conclude, we talked about testing athletes for cannabis use and talked about various methodologies, including immunoassay and mass spectrometry. We also discussed urine and oral fluid as biological matrices and noted that oral fluid is not yet approved as a biological matrix in WADA and NCAA testing. We talked about a lot of variable thresholds in urine. The Screen 20 Confirm 5 is currently our most predominant cutoff used. We did review some passive inhalation studies and saw that this is unlikely to cause a positive, but it can under extreme conditions. It's just going to be how much were they exposed and when was that exposure relative to collection of the specimen in question. We looked at historical positivity at Aegis, which was roughly about 4%, and we saw that since 2014-15, we started to see a steady increase, and the current positivity is 11.9%. We also discussed CBD and THC products and noted that they may contain THC, and the product percentage of THC, the extent of use may result in a positive drug test result. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions for you in a little bit. For me, on the legal side, we do see all these new cannabinoids coming out on the market. Delta-8 has become extremely hot. You can find it in smoke shops everywhere, and it has caught national headlines because the regulators don't know what to do with it, so it's very much a state-by-state approach. But the manufacturers are one step ahead because other products are taking its place. THCO, HHC. a client just emailed me a list, and he's like, what about these? I'm like, I don't know, I have to talk to some scientists and get back to you. But it's just interesting to see how many different products are now coming out, from being derived from hemp. And what's really interesting as far as like testing, for instance, the threshold on hemp, it's 0.3% on a dry weight basis to meet the definition of hemp. But when you're thinking about it in like something dense like a cookie or a brownie, while it technically falls under the threshold and is classified as hemp, it still could have a couple milligrams of THC in it. So while it's a legal product and it's considered a hemp product, you could still trigger for a THC test. So it's really, really important to know. A lot of people think, oh, it's CBD, what's that going to do to me? There is THC in it, so you could test positive, and we see that in the employment context with athletes. So it's very interesting, absolutely. So thank you. Your presentation was wonderful. Next, we're going to talk about college athletes. Steve Walz is the Associate Athletic Director for USF, and he's going to talk about kind of the approach today. We've heard through this conference that there are we're seeing municipal and therapeutic uses, and some of which have less side effects than traditional opioids or other medications. So there is possibly, a real use for marijuana, and we're going to hear how that is now being influenced and how that's coming about with the collegiate athletes.
Good morning, everybody. When you do one of these talks and you're on a panel, you don't know, when you haven't met each other, what everybody's going to say, so you hope you're not duplicating everything, but I think this will work out perfectly. Again, I'm Steve Walz. I am the Director of Athletic Medicine at USF. I have been for a little over 26 years now, and just talk to you a little bit about how this applies to the NCAA, because we've seen a lot of changes here recently, especially. I do have a couple of financial disclosures with Sunflora. I'm actually doing a little research for them in regards to pain management and collegiate athletes. But what we're really looking at is kind of the history, which Dr. Shelby showed a little bit, some of the healthcare concerns with what our student athletes are taking right now anyway, some of the mental health aspects as it goes into it, and then just some things to consider moving forward. I don't know if anybody else put these disclaimers in, but as a NCAA and public university employee, I am not advocating drug use. These thoughts are my own and not the University of South Florida or the NCAA. I have a lot of opinions on the NCAA, but I won't get into a lot of those right now. Just a quick background of my personal history. I'm a relative novice when it comes to this subject. I've never smoked. I haven't ingested any THC products. I have started utilizing the CBD products, and they're wonderful. And learning more about it every single day. I have been in charge of drug testing at my institution for the past 20 plus years. So dealing with that as it's changed over the last couple of decades has been very interesting. And I did actually have a medical use patient way back in 2004 with medical marijuana, and I had a lot of, let's just say my views on it have changed 180 degrees since 2004. But I did get to witness a cancer patient. We had a young man on our basketball team that had a really bad cancer in his kidneys that ultimately took his life, but trying to keep weight on him, trying to keep the pain away, all that. So that started opening up my eyes even way back in 2004 on the medicinal uses of this. So one of the things we fight in collegiate athletics right now is the perceptions of the use. You know, it's a recreational drug. Sometimes the coaches don't understand, the administrators. So there's a lot of education that has to go on right now. It's illegal, it's criminal. You know, it only comes from low-income student athletes and where they're coming from with their family. They don't have much education on it. the different terms that they're called, if they test positive for a marijuana test. So we're trying to get the stigma out in NCAA sports about, the criminalization, the use of it, how it can be used effectively, and not so much to stigmatize it or deter the behavior, but educate the behavior. So one of the issues we come across is, we have student athletes at USF, and as most colleges do across the country. So part of the problem is it's all over the map, as you can see, on what's legal and what's not. And you really have to know your state's laws, especially working at NCAA institutions, to know what you can allow or what you can't allow. And, some of the changes that the NCAA has instituted is helping with that, and seeing some of the different testing levels and what pops on tests is obviously very helpful. And I will say we are a client of Aegis too, so we do all our drug testing probably for the last 10 or so years with them, and it's been great because we can look at different things and different types of substances as well. So what could these products replace? I mean, it's been mentioned before. One of the things that got me interested in this was after 26 years, you have a lot of student athletes that have surgeries. You have a lot of student athletes that have painful injuries. And I have seen student athletes develop addictions due to opioids. And it's heartbreaking to watch them go through that. And there's a lot of reasons that happens, but is there a way we can take care of their pain that's a lot safer and that's much more healthy for them? We also have student athletes that have a lot of sleep issues. If you think about what these kids go through in their day, and they get to play a sport, but they are just beaten down with that sport a lot of times, practicing 20 hours a week, treatments they get, they're in classes 15 hours a week, they have to go to tutoring probably another 15 hours a week. I mean, it's an 80-hour-a-week job when you break down what the student athlete goes through. So, can we find ways to help them sleep better? We know sleep, we could do a whole nother presentation on sleep and the effectiveness on your health. Excessive anti-inflammatories, that's another reason we need to find something different for these kids, because they just, they'll pop a bunch of Advil, they'll pop a bunch of, ibuprofen, Tylenol, things like that, which is effective in limited amounts, but if they're taking it over and over again, what's it doing to their kidneys as it goes through their system? Antidepressants, as we're seeing in a lot of our student athletes nowadays, is mental health concerns, and I'll get into a little bit more of that here in a minute. So the use of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs is very prevalent, I'll tell you, both prescribed for them and them taking others' prescriptions as well, so which is a big concern. So we've seen a little bit of these drug testing cutoff levels, and this is, I think, the most current one. It seems to change all the time, but as was stated before, a lot of them have gone to 150 nanograms. And if you look at the far right side, you'll see what the punishment, quote unquote, is for positives. Now, in the past, punishment has ranged with the NCAA of a year suspension for all drugs, and then they backed off a few years ago for, they separated out marijuana, and it was still 6 months of a suspension if you tested positive one time for marijuana, and that was at the 35 nanogram level, not to mention it was a much lower level. I look at this and I think it's interesting that the WNBA is at such a low level. It's certainly not consistent with the other leagues for sure, but you'll notice that the punishment is getting less and less and trending towards education, and I think that's where we really need to get. So the NCAA program history, Dr. Shelby talked about it a little bit as well. When I first started drug testing, and it was before we used Aegis, they recommended we tested at 5 nanograms. They said that can't be That's what's so interesting about, being in a small room with inhalation. They said that's just smoking. Anything over 5 would be just smoking. And we've learned a lot since then. That was probably 2000, 2001 when we started that. And then it increased to 15 nanograms for a lot of institutions and the NCAA. And what you'll find is a lot of institutions will just mimic what the NCAA is doing anyway as far as cutoff levels. And then 2019 increased to 35, and then back in February increased to 150 nanograms per milliliter. And with us, like we also at USF, we took the punishment part out. We implemented counseling for those who need it. And basically the only punishment you can get is if you don't attend the sessions we're asking you to attend, which is a lot of very similar to what the NCAA is doing, very similar to what some of the pro leagues are doing as well. So for testing in NCAA athletes, as an institution, you don't have to do it. You don't have to have a policy of it. You can just rely on the NCAA test. And an NCAA test happens about once, maybe twice a year on a random basis at any school, and about 26 to 28 athletes per test. So it's not a lot. Now, if you go to championship events, that's when they test you. A lot of times, NCAA basketball events, bowl games for football, they might take you, and it's hit or miss. You never know if you're going to be selected for testing or not. So as an institution, you don't have to test. The only NCAA rule is if you have a policy, you have to follow it. So I can't have a policy saying I'm going to test at 5 nanograms per milliliter, but I get 200 positive test results, and I decide I don't want to do anything about that. That's an NCAA violation. So the majority, I would say the overwhelming majority of schools do have policies about it. But again, you just have to follow it. With the NCAA, as I said, they raised their threshold. There's no penalty to that unless they don't follow your institution's guideline for counseling. So it's really up to each institution that the NCAA has put that back on. And, personally, why I think the NCAA shouldn't test for it and should concentrate on performance-enhancing drugs that change the outcomes of games. They've taken at least this step. Hopefully they continue to take steps. Because cannabinoids are still on their banned list, which is doesn't make sense, for a lot of things. And so when it puts you in a position as a director of athletic medicine of what you can provide your students, because if something negative happens and they test positive on an NCAA test, they'll say you did it, you gave it to them. So if we could eliminate some of those things, that opens up our box of tools of therapeutic interventions that we can do for these student athletes. And there's no medical exception for medical cannabis use in the NCAA, which there is for stimulants, there is for anabolic agents, but yet there's not for that. So that's another thing that needs to be looked at as we move forward. So there was a small dissertation study done about use by NCAA student athletes, and it was small. It was only 47 respondents, but it's a start of, I think, where we need to go with looking at some of this stuff. 28% of those were using CBD products for pain management, and again, I think this is going to be an important part for our student athletes moving forward, to take something safer for them when they deal with pain. And I will tell you, as a practitioner for collegiate athletes, they all have pain all the time. And they come in hurt. They come from high school and their club teams, and they're certainly not a clean bill of health by the time we get them when they're 18 at our university. So we're constantly dealing with inflammation and pain and different medical issues with our student athletes. 21% of those reported daily use, so they're using it. So now we gotta educate them on how to use it, when to use it, and things of that nature. What I found interesting, only 4 of the 47 respondents reported using THC, but again, knowing student athletes, They probably wanted to know who was asking because they don't like to give up that information too easily. So why should you still test? And we, at our institution, we went over this over and over again because I was ready to just be done with it. I didn't want to test it, like actually performing the test, bringing these kids in at 6 a.m. in the morning and having them go is a complete nightmare for me because they complain and bitch the whole time. So, but after talking with our director of sports psychology, it is a means for us to get some of our student athletes in his door, of those that really have problems, those that are smoking for a mental health reason, are getting in his door that otherwise wouldn't have probably gone to see him because they didn't test positive for anything. There's a stigma to mental health, all of that kind of stuff. But you have to know why you're testing. You know, are you doing it to punish the athlete? Are you doing it to help the athlete? Are you doing it to find something out, or just to say you can't do this? And I think that's going to be the big differentiation of trends in drug testing now, because you look at the athlete's history and they smoke or they ingest for a variety of reasons. A lot do it because they've always been doing it, and they do it with their parents and they do it with their families. And for us to think that we can make them stop for a 4-year period or whatever it is really not going to happen. So finding out why they're doing it, if it's at a high level, and again, it helps to have those cutoff levels at a higher level, because then you see more chronic use, you see more uses of abuse, instead of somebody going out for the weekend and just saying, I was with the boys, things got a little crazy and we had a good weekend. So we don't want to catch those people. We want to catch the people that are hurting, that are using it, where we could have them use it in a different way or in a more productive way that helps them out in the long run. So this is how we educate them. We give them the facts. We tell them, about products, things that are, applicable to their situation. Again, don't try to get them to stop. I mean, we have kids test at 2,500 nanograms. I mean, they probably just, ate a huge brownie before they came in for the test. But it's not realistic to have them just stop. So talk to them. You let the counseling do it. We are going more on a performance measure of educating our student athletes on, okay, if you take in a lot of THC on a Friday night before a Saturday football game, you might not have the best reaction time on the field tomorrow. So maybe it's not Friday night you're taking it. Maybe it's Monday or Sunday or after the game or something like that. Again, we're not trying to get them to stop, but we're trying to educate them on how it affects their bodies and their performance. And then alternatives that can help, CBD products, CBN products, things like that. And we've had this discussion with some colleagues about, is this a sports performance piece? It depends how you look at sports performance. Is it physiologically or mentally? Because I'll argue that you can use CBD products, CBN products, things like that for performance, but it's leading up to the performance. Again, if you have an athlete that can sleep and recover and not be anxious and not have inflammation, then that's going to help their performance. So is it performance enhancing? Maybe not when you break down the physiological part, but when you look at the mental health and the preparation for prepping for an event, then I think it can be very helpful. So what needs to be done now, and I'm sure this has been talked about all weekend, research. We need to know more about how different things affect different injuries, post-surgical stuff, chronic stuff, things like that. We need to know more. Obviously, the long-term effects, we encounter a very similar type of regulation, issue when we deal with supplements in NCAA sports too. So, you know, somebody goes to GNC and buys a supplement, we can't definitively really tell them that supplement is completely legal. It doesn't have some sort of anabolic steroid in it, or it doesn't have this. So finding out products that are good to take, clean to take, that one of those 31% that say what's in it is actually in it, would be very helpful in moving forward with our NCAA athletes. And again, education, destigmatize it. It's such a hard thing to do with them because it's illegal, yet it's not illegal, you know, and it depends what state you're in. And if USF travels to, I'm just throwing out a state, Kansas, to go play a football game, and we've been using products, but now we're in a state that can't, what happens there? So it's very difficult, and it confuses a lot of people, including myself, when we talk about different state-by-state regulations. So it obviously confuses our student athletes with it as well. So, A, know the laws in your state, and that's what we try to get through to the ones we talk to. And like any supplement or medication, you know, it must be used correctly. And that's, again, the education process that we're trying to do with our student athletes as we go through learning more and more about the different cannabis products. So these are just some resources that we utilize. Our National Athletic Trainers Organization has a good page. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Conan, and then a couple of our pharmacy people at USF have helped me out tremendously, and our Director of Sports Psychology, Dr. Dortfeld, has been instrumental in helping me put some of these stuff together as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We are going to open it up to questions and answer question session now. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you. Perfect. I have a whole litany, so I'll let you guys go first, though.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Thank you for the great talks. My name is Matt Waddell. I'm the founder of Runner's High Cannabis, which is a THC-based athletic fuel. So I'm kind of on the other side of the testing thing, and coming from more legalized states. And I'm curious, and I'm a former NCAA college football player as well, but I'm curious about the need for you talked about a counseling and treatment plan. You also talked about people using cannabis for mental health, right? And maybe those treatment plans being a way to get people in the door. But I think that those prescribed treatment plans, if someone's already using it for mental health and already on that way, what is the utility of that if you're from the top down saying you must have a treatment plan? Because it almost seems to assume there's something wrong with using cannabis, right? And I think it's by putting that into the way that we go about it, we're perpetuating the problem that we seek to fix, right? So I guess just broadly.
Sure. So, you know, that's a great point, and that was part of the discussion when we were talking about even not testing at all, is that's not it. So the treatment plan is voluntary, ultimately. So it's not mandatory that they have to go through it. So it might be one session where they meet with our Director of Sports Psychology, and then they're like, there's no real problem here. But it does help get some of those people at least in the door, and breaks down the stigma of the mental health side a little bit. But I do see where you're coming from as far as it perpetuating that it's a problem. I think it just helps us identify, you know, if you think about it like from a physical injury problem too, you know, we have And you being a student athlete probably did the same thing. Didn't want the athletic trainers to know you were hurt. You know, you didn't want them to hold you out. Sometimes it's good to get you in the door. We're not going to hold you out, but we want to help, you know, you not suffer through your injury. So that's kind of the mindset.
Y'all, thank you very much. I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to ask. My name's Ron Watson. For you, Steve, I guess a couple of questions. So I guess every NCAA school has a different policy. Is that what you basically said, that you have to have a policy? So if each school will then have their own policy?
They don't have to, but each NCAA school can have their own institutional policy.
If they don't, what is the policy?
Then you're just at the NCAA's policy, basically.
Are any of your students actual medical card holders, and does that change the equation for how you talk to them?
As far as I know, excuse me, right now we don't have any medical card holders. I think it would change. Again, it could change institutionally is all I can control or I can recommend. But again, with the NCAA, there's no exceptions for that as of right now. Institutionally, if I had a student come to me with a medical card and they're being treated for something, I would look at it just like us putting in an exception for Adderall because they have ADHD or, hormone imbalance or things like that.
I find it ironic that there's no exceptions, but they've raised the nanogram level to 150. So there's no exceptions, but there's you can get away with this much. That's an interesting policy to have.
NCAA is full of ironies. I'll just tell you that.
I would also say, to me, the enhancement versus recovery argument, or debate rather, I think is fascinating because I think that could shape policies in the future. I mean, obviously you don't want to have a advantage over one athlete, because they're using and you're not. But I view it as you can't, you're taking away an ice bath from someone for recovery. So that's the intriguing part to me. But I must admit that I do believe I play golf better sometimes medicated than not. So is that just back to the mental side of it? Am I more relaxed? Am I more focused? Am I less nervous? I don't know. It's fascinating. And then the last thing I'll just say is that I heard years ago, and this addresses the mental health aspect, what's the difference between medical use and adult use? And I thought it was fascinating. The gentleman said, well, the way I look at it is whether your mama tells you to eat Brussels sprouts or you choose to eat them on your own, doesn't your body get the exact same nutrition? And so what I would argue here is that regardless of whether you're doing it for fun or whether you know exactly how it's helping your body, doesn't your body get the exact same benefit?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. I agree they were just awesome this morning. So I'm Jeff Tinas, and we have a new CBD brand that's focused primarily on athletics, although it's finding broader receptivity. And I'm really interested, Steve, in at the university level, how the policies that you kind of refer to are actually made. Because, on the one hand, we're focused here on talking about cannabis in sports, but your athletic department is part of a bigger organization, right, the university. And we, for example, in some of our early products, have found great receptivity in certain athletic departments. One in particular that I would just use anecdotally is probably the equivalent in esports, whether you like that or not, esports and gaming, to what Alabama is to college football. And the director of that program loves all three of our products: a kinesiology tape that players can wear on top of their fingers to keep inflammation down, a drink mix with CBD but also with lutein for their vision health because they're taking on so much blue light, and a nootropic for their mental acuity and they sleep better, and then actually a sleep tablet, a CBN sleep tablet. He would be using these in his recruiting, he said, to get students sitting in the living room with parents say, this is what we're going to provide to your students if they come to our university. But the university won't approve the use of CBD. We're talking about CBD here. So I'm wondering, in your university, what's the governance structure around actually making these decisions? Because at the end of the day, aren't they university decisions and not athletic department decisions? And who would you consider to be sort of benchmark out there in the world of universities who have, a kind of respectable governance structure that's taking in all the different experiences and expert advice they should in order to have a university-wide policy. Thank you.
I think for us, it's, you know, when you work for a large state university, it's very political, from the president of the university or really above them with the board of trustees on down. So you have to, you know, work up the chain if you try anything, and a lot of times, you know, you hit a lot of dead ends with it. So so for us, you know, our policies are made through legal counsel and then up the chain with that. I don't have a lot of information on what the other schools' governance structures are, but anecdotally, the schools that I've talked to that are private schools are, especially up the East Coast, are a lot more liberal with how they can utilize some of these products. It's just easier for them to put that into their policies and procedures.
So, yeah, I think you working with universities on some issues that I've dealt with in the past, it's usually the attorneys that are the ones advising the universities as to what they can and cannot have for policies. So I think really fundamentally that's where you have to go to and find out. I know, you know, we recently had a case where we're asking the, you know, dean and assistant dean and head of the program, you know, hey, why did you come up with these policies and how? And they said, we have no idea, ask our attorney, so.
One last comment on that, because this conversation is still ongoing with this particular university, and in fact, it is the attorneys who have put the kibosh on this, and interestingly enough, they point to a 10-year-old policy of no drugs on campus, and this is a CBD product. So, you know, again, I'm hoping that there are some other examples out there. Maybe the private universities is where we need to go to look for kind of a more balanced approach to use of CBD on campuses.
Well, I think the interesting thing is in looking at some of those agreements and policies in colleges, you know, they do, again, they provide typically, so the national, the drug policy, the Drug Free Workplace Act defines prescription and non-prescription drugs, right? So typically in any sort of workplace or place of employment, if you have, like he said, you know, you have a prescription for that medication, you can go in there and then show it's positive. So then the drug tester will not even report it as a positive test, it'll be a negative test. So those are really the fundamentals we got to get into, because the definition, even on the federal level and in Florida specifically, it defines non-prescription or prescription drug. And that includes any over-the-counter or drug made legally available on the federal or state level. And with CBD, I think it's going to become very interesting on this aspect. Number one, the testing aspect. There has been, and talking to them, there has been even oils like compressed seed oils, the hemp oils and stuff like that, old tests that people can test positive for that. Number two, I think it's personally impossible to have a product and to say that it does not have any THC in it. It's fundamentally impossible. It goes back to the same issues that they have with nanogram levels, right? They test for 150 nanograms, and if it's under that, it's negative. The same thing the labs do when they're testing the CBD products. So I think both of those things are important that we have to look at. We have to go in and change school policies on private school versus public school. I think it's interesting because it's different accommodations. A private school technically may not be subject to the same ADA requirements and disability requirements that a public school would be, so that as these, this issue forms and changes, right? So CBD is recommended by a doctor now to prevent or help with arthritis or injuries that they have received, as opposed to an opiate. Will they have to change those policies and start to accept those things?
Hi, my background's in chemistry, but this question is for Dr. Shelby. I noticed the erratic sort of result on the CBD test where you were seeing 0.02% pop all the way up to 80 nanograms or something like that with a large variance. Have you guys, or how would you suggest or think about going through a more robust study, maybe a batch-specific one where you titrate up and down the dosage level on one batch or something like that so that you could actually get those nanogram levels on a linear scale maybe? Is there a way to kind of go about that?
So one thing I want to point out is that was not our study, but that was a study in scientific literature that was done. Now, one of the things that's going to contribute to the variability that you're seeing as far as the carboxy-THC concentration in urine is probably going to be dependent upon the athlete's state of hydration at the time of collection, because that can really impact on that. Now, also, things that can influence urinary concentration are going to be the dose that they're taking, the dosing frequency, and the time since they last used. That also, what impacts is the individual's metabolism, and also if you take drugs with food, this can impact if they have some kind of physiological or disease state. All of these things sort of play into a urinary concentration. So the range that you saw in that study, I would say one of the big factors is going to be how hydrated they were at the time that they were collected, or the last time they used it, or how much they were using it.
And I know in our practice, we've dealt with people on probation who've had to deal with this, and I think with athletes it may be interesting. So we had a toxicologist come in, potentially testing-wise determined. But so he, a young individual, he got in trouble. He started working out. Before that, he had a higher fat concentration, and toxicologist basically was, and he promised he, again, hadn't used since he went on. But so 2 months into probation, he starts exercising and working out. Our toxicologist came in and said that that could have also caused a spike because now he's burning fat cells, and the THC stores in the fat cells. So it wasn't a use issue, but it was, a change in his lifestyle as to what he did, which caused a higher concentration, which literally almost, caused him to go to jail. So
I just wanted to comment on that. There is a study in scientific literature regarding moderate exercise. What they showed was that moderate exercise did not cause an increase in result, but a lot of athletes are not doing what they described in the paper as moderate exercise. I'm not aware of any scientific paper regarding, extensive exercise that athletes would typically be doing.
These are all great questions. Do we have time maybe for one more question?
Thank you, and great presentations, all three of you. Very much appreciate that. A lot of discussion about numbers of nanograms per mil. And the one question I get asked all the time from athletes is, what does that mean? How much, how many edibles, how many joints to get to 150?
Oh boy, that's rough. There's all the sorts of things that play into that. You have the percentage of THC. You have, how much did they smoke? How long did they hold it? All this plays into it. Essentially, from an interpretation side, if we saw a 150 nanogram per mil concentration, we would say to the client, this is consistent with recent and or regular use. Unfortunately, some of the times when you see a concentration in urine, you don't know whether it's from residual, from cessation of a large amount, or whether it's from recent use. So with a 150 and above, we would say that's consistent with recent or regular use. That's about all we can say with that number.
That's my classic academic answer that they don't accept, because they'll say, I just take this to wind down each night. And is what I take for winding down going to pop tomorrow morning if I get tested? Is it too much? Can I actually take a little more if I need to and I had a really tough day? And I give them all the it depends answers. That's not what they want to hear.
Yeah, if they're using acute use within 3 to 5 days, you can definitely test positive. Again, the threshold is going to play into it. What's interesting is we did have a client that moved to 150 when WADA moved to 150. And what they saw was a shocker for them, because actually their positivity rate increased when they went to 150. And, it's kind of thinking about why did that happen? And I don't think that they notified anybody that they were moving to 150. So a lot of what could be happening is you could have athletes that are using and then they get drug tested and nobody comes to them and says you were positive. So they think, oh, well, maybe I could use a little bit more, or maybe I don't have to stop use prior to this particular event. And so then what happens is then when they reach that 150 threshold, then they're just way positive.
And Ron alluded to that with the irony of the NCAA. When the threshold was 35, if you had anything in your system, you were going to pop. And now that it's 150, in some of their eyes, it's a license to smoke, essentially. And they just want to know, how much more can I do before I hit that bar? And Steve alluded to the transformation of it's not a penalty bar, it's an issue. You know, if you're 150 or 140 or 130, to us, it's actually the same. Why do you need to do this? Is it helpful, hurtful? Is it impairing performance? Whatever the reasons are. And I like, Steve, I appreciate your answer, because whenever someone goes to see you, they know, uh-oh, my test came back and that's why I'm visiting you again. And that's how the sports psychologists view it. So it's good for them to develop those relationships under any circumstance. Otherwise, when someone's sent to them, it's difficult for them. They walk in with their guard up. So I applaud you for the directions you all are going in.
So I did want to comment just on your question earlier regarding substance use. I don't think it's necessarily even marijuana, but there is crossover between substance abuse disorders and mental illness. And so I think maybe they're just including marijuana in that, because you can have cannabis use disorder. So that does put them then in touch with the psychiatrist that could help in the situations in which it's needed.
And I would say the other part to that is we totally gloss over alcohol. I mean, it's ridiculous that, you know, you have we talk about student athletes that come to a tutoring session or they come to study hall and they smell of weed. And then, you know, of course, the first reaction by the academic staff is that we got to test them, reasonable suspicion. Like, okay, again, it's a pain in my ass. But nobody tells me when somebody smells of alcohol. And I've sent student athletes away when they come into the athletic training rooms, you know, smelling of alcohol. Again, this probably opens up a can of worms, but I would find it much safer for an athlete to participate having done cannabis-related stuff than what they're doing drunk on alcohol.
Yes, thank you very much. We are over on our time, so for the people in the room, we're just cutting into the break. Do we have time for one more? Go.
Sure, one quick question.
Is there any possibility that your athletes are allowed to talk to CBD companies and or MMTCs on the NIL? Name, image, likeness.
Perfect. Stick around, sir. It's going to be addressed on the next panel. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Stick around. We have one more panel left for you today.